The debris field stretched across 300 kilometers of empty space like the skeleton of something that had died screaming. Twisted hull plating, shattered cargo pods, and frozen clouds of coolant drifted in silence where a trade convoy had been ambushed 2 days earlier. Pirates had taken everything worth taking and left the rest to rot. Davi Renner guided his salvage hauler, the drift line, through the wreckage with practiced hands. He had been doing this for 9 years, flying into the aftermath of other people's disasters, picking through what remained, selling it at the nearest station for enough credits to keep flying. It was not glamorous work. It was not even respectable work. But it was quiet, and quiet was all Davi wanted from the universe anymore. "Scan is complete," said Rio, his onboard AI, through the cockpit speakers. Approximately 14 tons of recoverable alloy, 6 intact power cells, 1 cracked navigational array that might fetch a decent price if you clean it up. "Good enough," Davi muttered. He angled the drift line toward the nearest cluster of wreckage and powered up the grappling arm. "There is one additional item," Rio said. "What kind of item?" "A life sign." Davi's hand stopped on the controls. "What?" "Faint biological reading inside a cargo pod. Designation unknown. Roughly 40 meters to your port side. The signal is weak but consistent." Davi turned and looked out the viewport. Among the floating junk, he spotted a cargo pod about the size of a ground vehicle. It was cracked along one side, venting a thin trail of atmosphere. Whatever was inside was running out of air. He thought about ignoring it. Could be a trapped animal from the convoy's livestock shipment. Could be a nest of vermin that had burrowed into the cargo. Either way, it was not his problem. The life sign flickered on Rio's display. "How long does it have?" Davi asked. "At current atmospheric loss, perhaps 2 hours." Davi swore quietly and engaged the grappling ARM. It took 10 minutes to haul the pod into the driftline's cargo bay and seal the airlock behind it. Davi pulled on his work gloves, grabbed a cutting torch, and walked down to the bay. The pod sat under the harsh overhead lights, dented and scarred. Something had hit it hard enough to crack the outer shell. The convoy's attackers had probably knocked it loose during the raid and never bothered to check what was inside. Davi fired up the torch and cut through the damage panel. The metal peeled back with a groan, and stale air hissed out. He leaned in, expecting to find a half-dead animal or maybe some kind of cargo organism in a shipping container. Instead, he found a child. She was small, no bigger than a human toddler, curled into a tight ball in the corner of the pod. Her body was covered in deep violet and silver scales that should have shimmered, but instead looked dull and dry from dehydration. Thin, translucent wing membranes pressed flat against her back, too undeveloped for flight. Her tail was wrapped around her own body like she was trying to hold herself together. She was Draelkin. Davi felt his blood go cold. He knew what the Draelkin were. Everyone in the galaxy did. Ancient, powerful, territorial. They were a draconic species that viewed most other races the way a hawk views insects. Their warriors could tear through starship hulls with their bare claws. Their elders commanded fleets that made Terran battlecruisers look like fishing boats. And they despised humans above almost all other species, calling them reckless, short-lived creatures from a world so dangerous it should have killed them all long ago. And one of their children was sitting in his cargo bay. The hatchling clutched something in her small claws. A wooden toy, hand-carved into the shape of an adult Draelkin. It was broken, snapped clean in half, probably during the attack. She held both pieces against her chest like they were the most important things in the universe. Her golden eyes opened and looked up at him. She was shaking. Her nostrils flared with rapid, shallow breaths. A sound came from her throat, not a roar or a hiss, but a small, broken whimper that sounded exactly like what it was. A frightened child who had been alone in the dark for days, holding a broken piece of home. Davi stood there for a long moment. Every rational thought in his head told him to close the pod, dock at the nearest station, and hand this problem to someone else. Having a Draelkin child on a human ship was not just dangerous. It was a death sentence if her people found out and assumed the worst. The hatchling whimpered again. A single tear, thick and silvery, rolled down her scaled cheek. "Rio," Davi said quietly. Yes. What do Draelkin hatchlings need to survive? I will compile what data is available. I should warn you, it is not extensive. The Draelkin do not share biological information with outsiders. Do your best. Davi knelt down slowly, keeping his movements gentle. The hatchling flinched but did not run. He reached out with both hands, carefully, the way he would pick up something fragile and irreplaceable, and lifted her from the pod. She weighed almost nothing. Her body was cold, far colder than it should have been. When he held her against his chest, she stiffened for a moment, then went still. Her tiny claws gripped the fabric of his jacket. He carried her to the cockpit and sat down in the pilot's seat, cradling her in one arm. She stared up at him with those enormous golden eyes, her broken toy still clutched tight. Rio, how far is the nearest Draelkin-controlled space? 11 days at maximum speed. Davi looked down at the small creature in his arms. She had stopped shaking. His body heat was soaking into her cold scales, and her breathing had begun to slow. 11 days. He repeated he had no idea what he was doing, but she was not going back in that pod. The first night was terrible. Suri, as Rio eventually identified her from a partial registry tag on the cargo pod, refused to eat. She refused to sleep. She wedged herself into the narrow gap between two cargo crates in the storage bay and hissed at anything that came close. Her golden eyes glowed faintly in the dark like two small lanterns filled with fear. Davi tried everything he could think of. He placed a bowl of nutrient paste near the gap. She knocked it over. He tried warming the area with a portable heater. She pushed it away with her tail. He tried talking to her in a calm voice. She bared tiny fangs that were barely sharper than a kitten's teeth and growled with all the fury her small body could produce. She is deeply stressed, Rio said from the ceiling speaker. Her scale coloration indicates severe dehydration and emotional distress. Draelkin hatchlings are never separated from their clutch. This level of isolation is essentially traumatic for her species. I know she's scared, Rio. I am trying. Perhaps try not trying. Davi frowned. What? Draelkin are apex predators, even as children. Direct approach triggers a defensive response. You might have more success by simply being present without engaging. Let her come to you. It sounded stupid. But nothing else was working. S.O. Davi sat down on the cargo bay floor about 3 meters from her hiding spot. He leaned against the wall, stretched his legs out, and did nothing. He did not look at her. He did not speak to her. He just sat there, breathing, existing, being a warm presence in a cold ship point. 20 minutes passed. 30. An hour. Then he heard a faint rustling. The sound of small claws on metal. He kept his eyes on the far wall and stayed perfectly still. From the corner of his vision, he saw Suri poke her head out from behind the crate. Her nostrils flared, testing the air. She sniffed in his direction several times, then pulled back. A minute later, she poked out again. This time she took one step forward, then another, then froze. Davi did not move. Suri watched him for a long time. Then she retreated back in her gap. But the next morning, the nutrient paste he left was gone. Over the next 2 days, a slow and fragile routine developed. Davi would sit on the cargo bay floor twice a day, always in the same spot, always quiet. Suri would watch from her hiding place. Each time, she crept a little closer before retreating. Each time, her growls were a little softer than on the second evening. Davi brought her broken toy with him. He sat on the floor, pulled out a tube of adhesive and a thin piece of wire from his repair kit, and started trying to fix it. He was not good at delicate work. His hands were built for hauling scrap and welding hull plates, not repairing tiny wooden carvings. The adhesive smeared. The wire bent wrong. He muttered under his breath and tried again. He felt her watching. The intensity of her gaze was almost physical. Rio had analyzed the toy earlier. It was hand-carved, the AI had said. The tool marks suggest it was made with personal instruments, not manufactured. Most likely carved by a parent or close family member. The wood is native to Draelkin nesting worlds. A parent had carved this for her, and now it was broken and the parent was gone, and this ugly little repair job by a human salvage worker was all she had. Davi kept working. The fix was rough. The seam where the two halves joined was visible and lumpy with dried adhesive. The wire reinforcement poked out slightly on one side. It was by any standard a terrible repair, but it held together. He placed the toy on the floor between them and leaned back. Suri stared at it. She crept forward, step by careful step, until she was close enough to reach it. She picked it up in both claws and turned it over, examining the repair. She ran one small finger along the seam. Then she looked at Davi, not with fear, not with the defensive fury of a cornered animal. She looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of trust. She placed her hand on his knee. Her claws were cold against his skin through the fabric. He held absolutely still, barely breathing. She did not pull away. After that, everything changed. Suri began following Davi around the ship. She stayed a few steps behind at first, then gradually closer, until she was practically walking on his heels. She watched him work the controls, watched him eat, watched him run maintenance checks. Her golden eyes tracked every movement he made with intense curiosity. She started making sounds that were not growls or hisses. Small chirps, musical trills, fragments of a language Rio could barely translate. One word came up again and again when she looked at Davi. The closest translation is warm one, Rio said. Draelkin hatchlings categorize beings by sensory traits. You radiate significantly more body heat than any species she would normally encounter. To her, you're defined by warmth. Warm one. Davi did not know what to do with that. He contacted a trade station on a secure channel and asked if anyone had reported a missing Draelkin child. The station operator laughed in his face. The Draelkin would never admit to losing a hatchling, the operator said. That would be the greatest shame a clutch could suffer. If one is missing, they will find it themselves or die trying. And if they find out a human had her, friend, you better hope you are already in a different galaxy. Davi closed the channel and looked down at Suri, who was sitting on the cockpit floor chewing on a piece of rubber insulation she had pulled off a cable. Stop eating my ship, he said. She chirped at him and kept chewing as he was in so much trouble. Checkpoint Halcyon sat at the intersection of three major trade corridors like a metal spider waiting in its web. Every ship passing between Terran Union space and the outer territories had to stop here for inspection. There was no way around it. Davi had thought about trying to slip past. He had even asked Rio to calculate a route that avoided the checkpoint entirely. The answer was an extra 19 days of travel through unpatrolled space, crawling with the same pirates who had destroyed the convoy where he found Suri. That was not an option, as he flew straight in, docked at Bay 14, and hoped for the best. Officer Bryn Gallows came aboard 20 minutes later. He was a tall man with a shaved head and a datapad in one hand, the kind of border patrol officer who had done this job long enough to be bored by it, but not long enough to stop being thorough. He checked Davi's salvage license, scanned the cargo bay, logged the recovered scrap metals, and was about halfway through a routine question about prohibited materials when Suri walked into the corridor behind Davi. She had been hiding in the sleeping quarters. She had gotten good at opening doors by standing on her tail and reaching the panel with both claws. She appeared in the hallway, clutching her repaired toy, and stared at Gallows with wide golden eyes. Gallows stared back. The datapad slipped from his hand and hit the floor. Is that, he said slowly, a Draelkin hatchling? Davi took a breath. Yes. On your ship. Yes. A human salvage operator has a Draelkin child on his ship. I found her in a wrecked cargo pod in the debris field near the Soren corridor. She was alone. She was dying. I pulled her out. Gallows looked at Davi with an expression that mixed disbelief with something close to pity. Then he reached for his communicator. I have to report this. You understand that. I understand. What followed was 4 hours of questions in a small gray room at the checkpoint security wing. Davi answered every one of them. Where he found her. Why he did not report it immediately. Why he was heading toward Draelkin space. The officers recorded everything and exchanged looks that said they thought he was either lying or insane. The worst part was that they took Suri, standard procedure for unaccompanied alien minors required placement in a holding area while authorities determined custody. 2 officers escorted her to a clean, well-lit room with soft flooring designed for vulnerable detainees. It was perfectly safe by every regulation in the book. Suri did not care about regulations. The moment they separated her from Davi, she screamed. Not a hiss, not a growl, but a full-throated shriek that resonated at a frequency Davi could feel in his teeth. The sound bounced off the metal walls of the checkpoint and traveled through corridors. Officers in other sections looked up from their work. A maintenance worker dropped a wrench. Two detainees in a nearby holding cell backed away from the shared wall. Gallows came running. Through the observation window, they watched Suri throw herself against the door, clawing at the frame. Her scales flushed from violet to dark crimson, a stress response so severe that even the checkpoint's basic xenobiology scanner flagged it as a medical concern. She tore at the soft flooring with her claws, shredding it. Her shrieks grew louder, more desperate. "She's going to hurt herself," Davi said. "We are following protocol," Gallows replied, but his voice was strained. "Your protocol is killing her. Draelkin hatchlings cannot be isolated. She has already been alone in a cargo pod for days. She is bonded to me. I am all she is right now. You are a human salvage worker. You are not her guardian. Tell her that." Another shriek. This one cracked the observation window. A thin line split across the glass from corner to corner. Gallows took a step back. "Let me in," Davi said. It was not a request. Gallows hesitated. He looked at the cracked window. He looked at the readings on the xenobiology scanner. He looked at Davi, a tired man in a worn jacket with grease under his fingernails, and made a decision that was nowhere in his training manual. He opened the door. Davi walked into the holding room. The floor was destroyed. Suri was pressed into the far corner, her small body trembling, her scales still flushed dark red. Her claws were raw from scratching at the walls. The broken toy lay on the floor where she had dropped it. He picked up the toy. Then he sat down on the shredded floor, cross-legged, and held it out. Suri launched herself across the room. She hit him in the chest hard enough to rock him backward, her small claws digging through his jacket into his skin. She buried her face against his neck and wrapped her tail around his arm. The screaming stopped. The only sound was her rapid breathing and the faint clicking of her claws as they gripped his clothing. Davi put one hand on her back. Her scales were hot from the stress flush. He could feel her hearts, both of them, hammering against his chest. "I am here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Through the cracked observation window, Gallows watched. Behind him, 3 other officers stood in silence. None of them had ever seen a Draelkin child choose a human. None of them had ever seen one stop mid-panic at the sound of a single voice. An hour later, Gallows signed a release authorization himself. He handed Davi his clearance chip and walked him back to the drift line. At the airlock, he stopped. "The Draelkin are not going to thank you for this," Gallows said. "You know that. They will see a human with one of their young, and they will assume the worst. They might kill you before you get a word out." Davi shifted Suri in his arms. She had fallen asleep against his chest, her grip still tight on his jacket. The repaired toy was tucked under one wing. "She's not cargo," Davi said. "She is not a problem to be processed. She's a kid who lost everything and found one person she trusts. I'm taking her home." Gallows looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. The drift line undocked from Checkpoint Halcyon and turned toward the outer territories. 3 days to the Draelkin border. Davi tried not to think about what was waiting for him on the other side. Somewhere between the stars, in a long, empty stretch of space where no station signals reached, Davi could not sleep. He sat in the cockpit with the lights dimmed, staring at the slow crawl of distant galaxies through the viewport. The drift line hummed around him, the quiet vibration of a ship that had been running too long and needed repairs he could not afford. Behind him, in the sleeping quarters, Suri was curled up on his bunk in a nest she had built from his spare blankets, 2 towels, and a jacket she had dragged off a hook point 3 days to the Draelkin border. 3 days, and then he would hand her over and go back to his empty ship and his empty routine and his empty life. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. "You have been staring at nothing for 47 minutes, Rio said. "I am thinking. Your cortisol levels suggest you are worrying, not thinking. There is a difference." "Thank you, Rio. You are welcome." The AI paused for a moment, which was unusual. Rio did not normally pause. "There is something you should hear," Rio said. "I intercepted a coded transmission approximately 2 hours ago on a Draelkin military frequency. I have been attempting to decrypt it." Davi sat up. "And it is a search signal. Broad spectrum, repeating on a 4-minute cycle. Someone is looking for a lost hatchling. The signal includes a biometric identifier that matches Suri's species markers. They are looking for her. Yes, but there is more. The signal carries an embedded warning. I will translate it as accurately as I can." Rio's voice shifted to a flat, neutral tone. "Any non-Draelkin entity found in possession of a Draelkin child will be classified as a hostile combatant and dealt with accordingly. No negotiation, no exception." The words hung in the dim cockpit like smoke. Davi leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. He had known this was coming. Gallos had warned him. The station operator had warned him. Every piece of common sense he possessed had warned him. The Draelkin were not going to see a kind human returning a lost child. They were going to see a death world predator who had taken one of their young. He thought about the smart move. Dock at a neutral station. Leave Suri with the authorities. File a report and disappear into the trade lanes before her people tracked him down. It was clean, safe, and logical. From the sleeping quarters, Suri whimpered in her sleep. Davi opened his eyes and listened. The whimper came again, louder, followed by a small, thrashing sound. Her claws scraped against the bunk frame. A nightmare. He got up and walked to the sleeping quarters. Suri was tangled in her blanket nest, her small body twitching, her wing membranes fluttering. Her mouth opened in a silent cry. Whatever she was dreaming about, it was the cargo pod, the darkness, the loneliness. Days of floating in the wreckage of a destroyed convoy with nothing but a broken toy and the fading hope that someone would come. Davi sat on the edge of the bunk and lifted her into his arms. She was rigid at first, still caught in the nightmare, her claws gripping at air. He held her against his chest, one hand supporting her back, and began to hum. It was not a Draelkin lullaby. It was an old song his mother used to sing in their apartment on a colony world that no longer existed. He barely remembered the words, but the melody had stayed with him through 20 years of loss and loneliness and empty space, sitting in some corner of his mind like a candle that refused to go out. Suri's body relaxed. Her claws stopped grabbing at nothing and instead found his shirt, gripping the fabric. Her breathing slowed. Her scales, which had gone dull with stress, gradually warmed back to their violet shimmer. She pressed her face into the hollow of his neck, and within minutes she was asleep again. Davi kept humming. He looked down at her and felt something crack open inside his chest that he had spent years sealing shut. It was the same feeling he had buried when he lost his sister during the colony raid. The same terrifying vulnerability of caring about someone small and fragile in a universe that broke small and fragile things without mercy. He did not want to give her up. The thought hit him like a fist. He had been telling himself this was temporary. A rescue. A delivery. But sitting here in the dim light with this tiny creature breathing against his neck, trusting him completely, he understood the truth. He loved this child, and in 3 days, he was going to hand her to people who hated his species and walk away. But she was not his. She had a family, a clutch, a world where she belonged. Keeping her would be selfish, and she deserved better than a broke salvage worker on a ship held together with welding tape. "Rio," he said quietly. "Yes." Respond to the Draelkin signal. A long silence. "Are you certain?" Their warning was explicit. "I know what their warning said. The probability of a hostile response is significant." "I know." "Then what would you like me to say?" Davi looked at the sleeping child in his arms. "Tell them, I have your child. She is alive. She is safe. I'm bringing her to you. I am human. I am unarmed. Do not shoot." Rio transmitted the message. Then silence. Hours of it. Davi sat in the cockpit with Suri asleep in a sling he had rigged from cargo straps. He watched the communication display and waited. The reply came at the edge of the next sleep cycle. A single line, transmitted on the same encrypted frequency. "Approach. Slowly. 2 words. No worms. Novidatitoth. Just a command from a species that had never once in galactic history welcomed a human into their space. Davi set the course and spent the remaining days teaching Suri small human words. She learned ship and eat and Rio. She learned to say his name, though it came out as Davi in her small, chirping voice, the syllables stretched and musical. She stopped calling him Warm One. She called him Davi now, and every time she said it, something in his chest ached in a way he was not prepared for. 2 days left. Then one. Then hours. He held her a little tighter and flew toward whatever was waiting. They came out of nothing. 1 moment. The space ahead of the drift line was empty. The next, 3 Draelkin warships shimmered into existence as their cloaking fields dissolved, each one the size of a small city. Their hulls were dark, organic-looking, covered in overlapping plates that resembled the scales of the species that built them. Weapon arrays the length of Davi's entire ship glowed with restrained energy along their spines. The driftline's threat detection system screamed. Every alarm on the console lit up at once. Rio's voice came through flat and calm. 3 Draelkin capital-class warships. The lead vessel is broadcasting an identifier. It is called the Burning Cradle. We are being targeted by approximately 46 weapon systems. 46, Davi repeated. I may have undercounted. Their targeting signatures overlap. Davi powered down his engines, shut off every system that could be mistaken for a weapon, and opened all frequencies. This is Davi Renner of the Driftline. I'm the one who sent the message. I have the child. I'm not armed. Requesting permission to be boarded. Silence. Then the Burning Cradle's docking clamps reached out and seized the drift line like a hand closing around a toy. Davi told Suri to stay in the sleeping quarters. She looked up at him with those golden eyes, and he could see she understood something was wrong. Her scales rippled with nervous color shifts. She clutched her repaired toy and pressed herself against the bunk. I will be right back, he said. Stay here. He walked to the main airlock and opened it. Matriarch Kelvane stood on the other side. She was enormous. 12 feet tall, her body encased in natural bone armor that had grown over decades of life. Her scales were deep black shot through with veins of gold, the markings of a Draelkin elder. Her wings were folded against her back, but the span was visible, wide enough to cast a shadow over the entire corridor. Her eyes were the same gold as Suri's, but ancient, filled with a cold fire that had been burning for centuries. Behind her stood 6 Draelkin warriors in full combat harness. Each one could have torn the drift line apart with their bare hands. Kelvane looked at Davi. She looked at the rusted walls of his ship, the patched hull plates, the flickering overhead lights. She looked at this small, soft, warm-blooded creature standing in front of her, and her lip curled. She moved faster than Davi's eyes could track. One massive clawed hand closed around his throat and lifted him off the floor, slamming him against the corridor wall. His feet dangled. Her claws pressed into his skin, not quite breaking it, holding him like something she was deciding whether to crush. Where is she? Kelvane said. Her voice was deep enough to vibrate in Davi's bones. Sleeping quarters, he managed. Down the hall. She is safe. Safe. The word came out like venom. You took a child of the Draelkin. You kept her on this wreck. You, a human, a creature from a world of death and violence, presumed to touch one of our young. I found her, in a destroyed cargo pod. She was alone and dying. Convenient. It is the truth. Kelvane's claws tightened. Davi felt his airway narrow. He did not struggle. He did not beg. He looked directly into her ancient golden eyes and said the only thing that mattered. She was alone. She was scared. I kept her warm. Something flickered in Kelvane's expression. A crack in the fury. Before she could respond, a sound came from the corridor behind Davi, a small chirp that Kelvane's eyes moved past him. Her grip loosened. Suri stood at the end of the hallway. She had not stayed in the sleeping quarters. She held her repaired toy in both claws and stared at the massive Draelkin elder with recognition slowly dawning on her face. Her grandmother, the one who had held her since the day she hatched. But Suri did not run to Kelvane. She ran to Davi. Her small body collided with his legs the moment Kelvane released him. He dropped to the floor, gasping, and Suri grabbed his trouser leg with one hand, pressing herself against his knee. She looked up at Kelvane with an expression that was protective. This tiny hatchling, standing in front of a human who was bruised and breathing hard, positioning herself between him and the most powerful being on the ship. The warriors behind Kelvane shifted. None of them had ever seen this. A Draelkin child defending an outsider. Kelvane stood motionless. The fury drained from her face, replaced by something raw and unguarded. Davi knelt down slowly and put his hand on Suri's head ridge, stroking it the way he had done every night for 11 days. "Go on," he whispered. "That is your family." Suri looked up at him. Her golden eyes were wet. She chirped once, softly, then turned and walked to Kelvane. The old matriarch bent down, and when she picked Suri up, her massive clawed hands were trembling. She held the child against her armored chest, and for a moment the ancient warrior looked like nothing more than a grandmother who had been terrified she would never hold this small life again. Suri nuzzled into Kelvane's neck, but she kept her eyes on Davi. Kelvane looked at him over the child's head. The hostility was gone. What remained was something more difficult: confusion, and the first fragile edge of respect. "Why?" she asked. "There was no reward, no alliance to gain. Humans do not help Draelkin. We have given your species no reason to." Davi stood up. His throat ached where her claws had held him. His legs were unsteady. He looked at the small violet shape clinging to the old dragon's chest, and he felt the loss of her already, like a door closing on the only warm room he had known in years. "She was crying," he said. "That was enough." Kelvane held his gaze for a long time. Then she turned, carrying Suri, and walked back through the airlock toward the burning cradle. The warriors followed. None of them looked back. The airlock sealed. The docking clamps released. The three warships shimmered and vanished, leaving Davi alone in the silence of his empty ship. The blankets still smelled like her. Davi stood in the sleeping quarters of the driftline, staring at the nest Suri had built on his bunk. The towels were still tangled together. His jacket was still balled up in the center where she liked to rest her head. A piece of rubber insulation she had been chewing on sat on the floor next to a dried smear of nutrient paste she had spilled 3 days ago. He should clean it up. He did not clean it up. He closed the door and went to the cockpit. The driftline drifted through open space, engines at quarter power, going nowhere in particular. The stars outside the viewport looked the same as they always had. The ship sounded the same. The recycled air tasted the same. Everything was exactly as it had been before he cut open that cargo pod. Except everything was different. "Your heart rate has been elevated for the past 6 hours, Rio said. "Your cortisol levels are consistent with acute emotional distress. You have not eaten since the Draelkin departed." "I am fine." "You are lying. I have known you for 9 years." "You are not fine." Davi said nothing. He sat in the pilot's seat, the one where Suri used to sit on his lap and tap at the controls with her claws while he pretended to let her steer. He could still feel the phantom weight of her against his chest. Rio was quiet for a moment. Then, without being asked, the AI played a melody through the cockpit speakers. It was the lullaby, the one Davi's mother used to sing, the one he had hummed to Suri in the dark when the nightmares came. Davi closed his eyes. He did not tell Rio to stop. 3 months passed. The driftline returned to the salvage routes. Davi picked through wreckage, sold scrap, refueled at stations, and kept moving the way he always had. The rhythm of his old life settled back around him like a coat that no longer fit right. The same motions, the same silences, the same empty cockpit. But something had shifted. The walls he had built around himself, the ones that had kept every living thing at a safe distance for years, had cracks in them now. A small dragon-shaped hole that he could not patch. He took a job he would never have taken before. A refugee convoy, 40 ships carrying displaced families from a border conflict, needed an escort through a dangerous stretch of unpatrolled space. The pay was almost nothing. The risk was significant. The old Davi would have flown past without a second thought. The new Davi flew alongside them for 8 days, scanning for threats, sharing fuel with a transport that was running dry, and fixing a broken water recycler on a family ship using parts from his own reserve. When the convoy reached safe harbor, the lead captain thanked him over the radio. Davi said it was nothing and meant it. He was sitting in the cockpit one evening, eating reheated protein from packet, when Rio spoke. There's an incoming vessel on long-range sensors. Davi set down his food. Pirate? No. Draelkin. His hands went still. Warship? Negative. The signature matches a diplomatic shuttle. Small. Unarmed. Is requesting permission to dock. Davi stared at the sensor display. A single Draelkin shuttle, alone, heading directly for the drift line. He could not imagine why. The Draelkin had Suri. They had no reason to come back. Unless something had gone wrong. Unless she was hurt, or sick, or asking for him, or grant permission, he said. The shuttle docked with a gentle clang. Davi walked to the airlock and opened it. Matriarch Kelvane stood in the corridor. She looked different from the last time he had seen her. The cold fury was gone. The rigid posture of a warrior preparing for battle had softened into something Davi did not have a word for. She looked like someone who had spent 3 months thinking about something that did not make sense to her and had finally decided to stop thinking and simply act. She carried a small package wrapped in dark cloth. Human, she said. Matriarch. They looked at each other across the airlock threshold. The last time they had been this close, her claws had been around his throat. May I enter? She asked. It was the most polite thing a Draelkin had ever said to a human. Davi stepped aside. Kelvane walked into the cockpit. She was too tall for the space and had to duck beneath the overhead conduits. She looked around at the worn console, the patched walls, the pilot's seat with its cracked upholstery. Then she held out the package. From a child, she said. Davi took it. He unwrapped the dark cloth carefully. Inside was a wooden figure, small enough to fit in his palm. It was hand-carved, but not by an expert. The lines were uneven, the proportions wrong, the surface rough with tool marks. It was clearly the work of a child who had watched her parent carve and tried to copy what she remembered that it was a human. A small wooden human with big round eyes and stubby arms. On the base, scratched in clumsy Draelkin script, was a single word. Rio, Davi said. His voice was not steady. Translate. Warm one, Rio said softly. Davi held the figure in both hands. His vision blurred. He blinked hard and kept his jaw tight. Kelvane watched him with ancient golden eyes. She asks about you, the matriarch said. Every day. She asks where Davi is. She asks when Davi is coming. She paused. The Clutch Council has debated for many weeks. What you did has never been done before. A human caring for a Draelkin child. Returning her without demand or condition. It challenged everything we believed about your species. She straightened, and despite the low ceiling, the motion carried the weight of centuries of authority. The Council has made a decision that has no precedent in our history. You are granted open passage into Draelkin territory. You are recognized as a guardian of the Clutch. You are welcome among us, Davi Renner. The words settled into the small cockpit like sunlight entering a room that had been dark for too long. Davi looked down at the little wooden figure in his hands. He ran his thumb over the rough carving, over the scratched word on the base. He thought about the night he had hummed his mother's lullaby to a frightened child who was not his own. He thought about the feeling of small claws gripping his shirt and a small face pressed against his neck. He set the figure on the console, right next to the pilot's seat where he could see it every time he sat down. Rio, he said. Yes, set a course. Where to? Davi smiled. It was a real smile, the first one in a long time. You know where. The driftline's engines powered up. The old ship turned slowly, pointing toward Draelkin space, and began to fly. Behind him, Rio's voice came through the speakers, quiet and warm. For the record, I always knew he would go back.